August 1945. 43 Japanese women huddled in a makeshift detention center on Okinawa, waiting to die. They had heard the stories. Enemy combatants weren't taken prisoner. They were eliminated. But what happened next would defy every expectation of war. This is the true story of how compassion triumphed over conflict, and how a group of American nurses risked everything to save lives that the world had already written off. The war had just ended, but the hatred hadn't. Lieutenant Helen Thompson stepped off the transport ship onto the scorched earth of Okinawa, her white nurse's uniform already soaking through with humidity and sea spray. She had been through hell in the Pacific Theater. 2 years of blood-soaked field hospitals, screaming soldiers, and death that came in waves she couldn't stop. Helen had learned to compartmentalize, to see bodies as problems to solve rather than lives to mourn. It was the only way to survive. Beside her, Nurse Ruth Nakamura carried her medical kit with practiced efficiency. Ruth's presence in the American military was complicated. Japanese-American, born in California, her family had spent the war in an internment camp while she proved her loyalty by saving American lives. Every day was a test. Every interaction a chance to prove she wasn't the enemy. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now on Japanese soil, wearing an American uniform, about to face her ancestral people as prisoners. Captain James Bradford met them at the dock. He was a weathered man in his 40s, career military, with eyes that had seen too much. He saluted crisply. "Welcome to Okinawa, Lieutenant Thompson. I wish I could say the situation was better than it is. We've got 43 Japanese women in detention. Civilians, mostly. Some were nurses, teachers, support staff for the Imperial Army. They're terrified. They think we're going to execute them." Helen's jaw tightened. "Are we?" Bradford's silence spoke volumes. Then he said, "My orders are unclear. Command is still deciding how to handle civilian detainees who worked with the military. In the meantime, they're in bad shape. Malnutrition, disease, injuries from the final battles. Some are barely conscious. That's why you're here. To assess and stabilize until we get further orders." Ruth spoke up, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was hearing. "How long have they been detained?" 3 weeks. We've provided basic food and water, but we don't have interpreters, and they won't accept help from us. They think everything we give them is poisoned or a trick before execution. The detention center was a converted warehouse near the coast. Barbed wire surrounded it. Armed guards stood at attention. As Helen and Ruth approached, they could hear sounds from inside. Soft crying, whispered prayers in Japanese. The smell hit them first. Sickness, unwashed bodies, fear. Inside, the women were separated into groups. Some lay on thin mats, too weak to move. Others sat against the walls, their eyes hollow and distant. When the American nurses entered, silence fell like a guillotine. 43 pairs of eyes fixed on them with a mixture of terror and resignation. Ruth felt her stomach twist. These could have been her aunts, her cousins, her mother. She stepped forward and spoke in Japanese, her voice gentle. "We are nurses. We are here to help you. You are not going to be harmed." The reaction was immediate. Gasps, confused murmurs. One elderly woman near the front stood slowly, her traditional clothing torn and dirty. She studied Ruth with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You speak our language, but you wear their uniform. Who are you?" Ruth met her gaze. "My name is Ruth Nakamura. I am American, but my grandparents came from Hiroshima. I am a nurse. This is Lieutenant Helen Thompson. She is also a nurse. We have been sent to provide medical care." The elderly woman's expression didn't soften. "I am Fumiko Watanabe. I was a midwife before the war. These women are under my care. Why should we trust you? We have heard what Americans do to prisoners. We have been told to expect death. Some of these women have already tried to take their own lives rather than face execution." Helen didn't need Ruth to translate the emotion in Fumiko's voice. She approached slowly, setting down her medical bag where everyone could see it. She pulled out bandages, medicine bottles, a stethoscope. She held them up, then gestured to the women. Ruth translated. "We have medicine, we have supplies, we want to examine you and treat your injuries and illnesses. That is all. No one here will harm you." Fumiko remained standing, a barrier between the nurses and the other women. "Prove it." "There is a young woman in the back. Keiko Yoshida. She is 8 months pregnant and has been bleeding. If you truly mean to help, Help her first. Helen and Ruth exchanged glances. Helen nodded. Ruth translated, and they carefully made their way through the crowd of women, who parted reluctantly. In the far corner, a young woman lay on a mat, her face pale and drenched in sweat. Her breathing was shallow. Blood stained the fabric beneath her. Helen knelt immediately, her training taking over. She placed her hand on Keiko's forehead. High fever. Ruth, I need you to ask her symptoms. When did the bleeding start? Has the baby moved? Ruth asked the questions in Japanese, her voice calm and professional. Keiko's responses were weak. 3 days ago. Bleeding started after abdominal pain. Baby hasn't moved since yesterday. She thinks the baby is dead. She thinks she is dying. Helen examined Keiko quickly, her hands gentle but efficient. Possible placental abruption. The baby might still be alive but in distress. She needs immediate intervention. We need to move her to a proper medical facility. Ruth, tell her we're going to help her. Tell her she and her baby have a chance if she trusts us. As Ruth translated, tears rolled down Keiko's cheeks. She whispered something. Ruth's voice cracked slightly. She says she is ready to die, but please save her baby if you can. She says her husband died in the Battle of Okinawa. The baby is all she has left of him. Helen felt something crack in the armor she had built around her heart. No one is dying today. Ruth, help me stabilize her for transport. We're taking her to the field hospital. Captain Bradford was outside when Helen emerged, supporting Keiko with Ruth on the other side. Sergeant Williams, the medic, rushed to help. Bradford's face was stern. Lieutenant, what are you doing? This woman needs emergency medical care. She's pregnant and hemorrhaging. If we don't operate, she and the baby will die. I'm taking her to the field hospital. Bradford stepped in front of them. You don't have authorization to move prisoners to American medical facilities. Those facilities are for our personnel. Helen's eyes blazed. I don't care about authorization, Captain. I'm a nurse. She's a patient. That's all that matters. Now either help us or get out of the way. Bradford stared at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. You're risking your career, Lieutenant. Then it won't be the first time. Come on, Ruth. They transported Keiko to the field hospital, where an Army surgeon, Major David Chen, was initially resistant. You want me to operate on a Japanese POW? Do you understand the political situation here, Lieutenant? Helen stood her ground. I understand that she's a pregnant woman dying in front of us. I understand that we took an oath. I understand that this is exactly the kind of moment that defines who we are. So yes, Major, I want you to operate. I'm asking you to be a doctor, not a soldier. Major Chen looked at Keiko, unconscious on the gurney, her small frame barely making a dent in the mattress. He sighed heavily. Prep her for surgery. And if anyone asks, this was my decision. The operation took 3 hours. Helen and Ruth assisted. The baby, a girl, was delivered via emergency cesarean section. She was small, barely 5 pounds, but her lungs were strong. Her first cry echoed through the surgical tent like a declaration of life against all odds. Keiko survived. When she woke and heard her daughter crying, she wept uncontrollably, clutching Ruth's hand and repeating the same words over and over. Thank you. Thank you. You saved her life. Word spread quickly through the detention center. The American nurses had saved Keiko and her baby. The wall of fear began to crack. When Helen and Ruth returned the next day with Sergeant Williams and additional medical supplies, the reception was different. Fumiko approached them, her weathered face showing something close to respect. You kept your word. You saved her. Perhaps I was wrong about Americans. Helen shook her head. You weren't wrong about war. War makes monsters of everyone, but we're trying to remember how to be human again. Will you let us examine the others? Fumiko nodded. She turned to the women and spoke in rapid Japanese. Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to form a line. Helen, Ruth, and Sergeant Williams spent the next 6 hours examining patients. The medical conditions were heartbreaking. Malnutrition, dysentery, infected wounds that had gone untreated for weeks, broken bones that had healed wrong, signs of physical and psychological trauma. One young woman, Sachiko Yamamoto, caught Ruth's attention. She was 22, thin as a rail, with intelligent eyes and a distinctive scar on her left arm. She spoke some English, learned before the war. I was nursing student in Tokyo. When war came, I volunteered to help wounded soldiers. I am not combatant. I only tried to help people like you. Ruth felt a deep connection. We're the same then. Just trying to help people in an impossible situation. What happened to your arm? Bomb fragment. During American air raid on Okinawa. I was helping evacuate hospital when building collapsed. Sachiko's voice was matter-of-fact, but her hands trembled. Many died. I survived. Now I wish I had died with them. There is no honor in being captured. My family will believe I am dead. It is better that way. Ruth gripped her hand. You're alive. That matters. And you can help us. We need someone who speaks both languages and understands medical care. Will you help us treat the others? Sachiko looked surprised. You trust me? Helen joined the conversation, though she didn't speak Japanese. Ruth translated. Helen says we need all the help we can get. Nurse to nurse. Will you work with us? Sachiko's eyes filled with tears. She nodded. Yes, I will help. Over the next 2 weeks, an unlikely alliance formed. Helen, Ruth, and Sachiko worked together daily, treating the 43 women. Sergeant Williams proved invaluable, his gruff exterior hiding a deeply compassionate nature. He procured extra supplies, sometimes through official channels, sometimes through creative requisition. Captain Bradford, though officially maintaining proper distance, ensured the nurses had what they needed and ran interference with higher command. But the political situation was deteriorating. News came through military channels that there were heated debates about how to handle Japanese civilians who had worked with the imperial military. Some voices called for trials, others for indefinite detention. A few extremists even suggested execution as war criminals. Helen was in the middle of changing bandages when Bradford pulled her aside one evening. Lieutenant, I need to speak with you privately. His face was grim. They walked outside the detention center. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in violent reds and oranges. Bradford lit a cigarette with shaking hands. I received orders today. The women are being transferred in 72 hours. They're being moved to a military tribunal in Manila. There's a strong possibility that they'll be tried as war criminals for supporting the Imperial Army. Helen felt her blood run cold. They're nurses, teachers, civilians. They were trying to survive a war they didn't start. I know, but the politics are complicated. There's enormous pressure for accountability. Americans want justice for what happened. Pearl Harbor, Bataan, the atrocities. Your women are caught in that machinery. They're not my women. They're just women. And this isn't justice, it's revenge. Helen's voice rose. We've spent 2 weeks earning their trust, healing them, showing them that not all Americans are monsters. And now we're going to ship them off to a trial that's already decided their guilt? Bradford looked at her steadily. What are you suggesting, Lieutenant? I'm suggesting we fight for them. We document every one of their stories. We prove they were non-combatants. We get testimony from Sachiko, from Fumiko, from the others who can verify they were medical and support personnel. We make the case that prosecuting them violates the Geneva Convention. Helen, the United States didn't sign certain provisions of the Geneva Convention regarding civilian detainees. Legally, we're in murky territory. Then we make it a moral argument. We saved Keiko's baby. Are we now going to make that baby an orphan? We promised these women they would be safe. Are we going to break that promise? Captain, you have daughters. What if they were on the other side of this? Bradford was quiet for a long time. Then he said, write your reports. Document everything. I'll send them up the chain. But Lieutenant, you need to understand that this might not be enough. The men making these decisions are in Washington. They're not seeing what we're seeing here. That night, Helen, Ruth, and Sachiko worked until dawn, compiling detailed medical records, personal histories, and testimonies for all 43 women. They documented each woman's role during the war. Teachers who had been conscripted to work in supply depots. Nurses who had treated wounded soldiers because that was their profession. Cooks, clerks, translators, all swept up in the machinery of war. Sachiko shared her own story in painful detail. She had been a second-year nursing student at Tokyo Imperial University when the war expanded. The government had required all medical students to serve. She was sent to Okinawa to work in field hospitals. She had seen terrible things. Japanese soldiers dying in agony. Civilians caught in crossfire. Children burned by American bombs. But she had also seen Japanese soldiers commit atrocities against Okinawan civilians who were considered insufficiently loyal. War had shown her that cruelty had no nationality. When I see American soldiers, I'm afraid. When they see me, they are angry. Both emotions make sense. But we are all victims of men who wanted power and sent young people to die for it. I do not want to die hating. I want to believe there is something better. Ruth recorded every word. Her own story intertwined with Sachiko's in painful ways. Ruth's family had lost everything when they were interned. Her father had died in the camp, broken by the injustice of being imprisoned by his own country. Ruth had joined the military to prove her loyalty, but also to honor her father's belief in American ideals. If we let them execute these women, what are we? What ideals are we defending? Helen finished the report in the early morning hours. It was 50 pages of documentation, testimony, and medical records. She added a final page in her own hand, a personal statement. As a United States Army nurse and an officer, I have spent 2 years in the Pacific Theater treating American casualties. I have seen the cost of this war in blood and suffering. I have every reason to hate the enemy, but I have learned that healing requires us to see past our hatred. The 43 women in this detention facility are not the enemy. They are human beings who were caught in circumstances beyond their control. They deserve mercy, not martyrdom. If we execute them or imprison them indefinitely, we become the monsters we claim to fight. I urge the reviewing officers to recognize their humanity and grant them clemency. Respectfully submitted, Lieutenant Helen Thompson. Captain Bradford submitted the report through official channels. Then they waited. The 72 hours ticked down. The women in the detention center sensed something was wrong. Fumiko approached Helen on the second day. You are worried. Something has changed. Helen didn't lie. There are orders to transfer all of you to Manila for trial. We're fighting it, but I don't know if we'll succeed. Fumiko nodded slowly. Then we will die with dignity. Thank you for trying. Thank you for showing us kindness when you did not have to. If we die, at least we die knowing that not all hope in humanity is lost. Helen felt tears stinging her eyes. She had promised herself not to cry anymore. She had seen too much death to keep crying. But these women had gotten past her defenses. You're not going to die. I won't let that happen. You are one lieutenant in a very large army. What can you do? I don't know yet. But I'll think of something. That night, Helen couldn't sleep. She walked the perimeter of the detention center, her mind racing. There had to be a way. Some regulation, some loophole, some authority she could invoke. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice Sergeant Williams sitting on a supply crate smoking a cigarette. He looked up as she approached. Can't sleep either, Lieutenant? Helen sat beside him. How do you fight orders you know are wrong? Williams was quiet for a moment. In my experience, you don't fight them head on. You work around them. Find the spaces between what's ordered and what's possible. He took a drag from his cigarette. You know, there's a medical regulation that says critically ill patients can't be transferred until they're stabilized. Medical officer has discretion to determine when that is. Helen's mind started working. How many of the women could legitimately be classified as too ill to transfer? William shrugged. Well, that would depend on the medical officer's assessment, wouldn't it? If I were doing an honest evaluation, I'd say at least half of them are in pretty rough shape. Might take weeks to get them stable enough for transport. Maybe longer. Helen understood. It was a delaying tactic. Not a solution, but it bought time. I'll need to do a complete medical reassessment tomorrow, with detailed documentation. Might want to ask Major Chen to co-sign that assessment. Carries more weight coming from a senior medical officer. Williams, you're a genius. I'm just a sergeant who doesn't like seeing innocent people killed because politicians need scapegoats. The next morning, Helen approached Major Chen with the plan. He listened, his face thoughtful. You're asking me to use medical authority to override military orders. I'm asking you to use medical authority to ensure patients aren't transferred when it would endanger their health. That's your right and responsibility as a physician. Chen smiled slightly. You're going to make a lot of enemies, Lieutenant. I've made peace with that. Major Chen conducted the medical assessment with Helen and Ruth. They were thorough and honest. 26 of the 43 women were genuinely too ill or injured to safely transfer. Malnutrition, untreated infections, psychological trauma that made them suicide risks. Chen signed the report, classifying them as non-transferable pending medical stabilization. Captain Bradford sent the report up the chain. The response came back quickly and angrily. Medical assessment noted. However, orders stand. All detainees to be transferred in 24 hours. Medical personnel can accompany to ensure care during transport. Helen read the response and felt fury building. They're going to do it anyway. They don't care about the medical evidence. Ruth's voice was quiet. Then we accompany them. If they're going to Manila for trial, we go too. We testify on their behalf. Helen looked at her. That could destroy your career. It could destroy all our careers. Ruth met her eyes. My family was imprisoned by their own government for having the wrong ancestry. If I don't stand up now, what was it all for? What did my father die for? Sergeant Williams stepped forward. Count me in. Someone's got to make sure the medical supplies make it to Manila. Even Sachiko, who had the most to lose, spoke up through Ruth's translation. I will testify. I will tell them the truth about us. If they execute me for it, so be it. But I will not die silent. Captain Bradford entered the room at that moment. He had been listening. His face was troubled. If you all go to Manila, who's going to run the field hospital here? Helen stood her ground. That's not my concern right now, Captain. Bradford sighed heavily. Then he said something that shocked them all. What if there was another option? What if the women never made it to Manila? Everyone stared at him. Helen spoke carefully. Captain, what are you suggesting? Bradford pulled out a map. There's a civilian repatriation program starting up. Red Cross and Allied occupation forces are beginning to process Japanese civilians for return to their home territories. It's chaotic. Records are incomplete. If a group of Japanese civilians showed up at the repatriation center in Naha with proper documentation stating they were cleared by medical and military personnel, they would probably be processed and sent home without too many questions. That's falsifying military records. That's dereliction of duty. That could get you court-martialed. Bradford looked at each of them. I've been in the military for 22 years. I've followed orders I disagreed with. I've done things I'm not proud of. I'm tired of being part of a machine that grinds up people and spits out statistics. These women don't deserve to die for being on the wrong side of history. If I can help them, I will. Are you with me? Helen felt something shift in her chest. Yes. Absolutely yes. They worked through the night. Captain Bradford used his authority to create transfer documents that reclassified the women as civilian non-combatants, cleared for repatriation. Major Chen added medical clearances. Helen, Ruth, and Sergeant Williams prepared the women. Fumiko organized the group with practiced efficiency once she understood the plan. She had the women destroy anything that identified them as having worked with the military. They would be civilians displaced by war, nothing more. Sachiko worked with Ruth to prep everyone on what to say if questioned. Keep story simple, no unnecessary details. The biggest challenge was Keiko and her newborn daughter. The baby was only 2 weeks old. Traveling would be difficult, but Keiko was determined. I have a sister in Fukuoka. If I can get home, we will have family. We will survive. Helen checked the baby one more time. She's small, but strong, like her mother. She handed Keiko extra medical supplies. Keep her warm. Feed her often. If she develops fever or stops eating, find help immediately. Keiko bowed deeply, tears streaming. You gave my daughter life twice. Once in surgery, once in freedom. I will name her Helen, if you permit. So she will always remember the American nurse who showed us mercy. Helen felt her composure cracking. I would be honored. The transport was arranged for dawn. Captain Bradford had requisitioned trucks under the guise of moving supplies to the repatriation center. The women were loaded carefully, covered with tarps to avoid attention. Helen, Ruth, and Sergeant Williams rode in the lead vehicle. The drive to Naha took 2 hours through devastated countryside. The scars of war were everywhere. Burned buildings, crater-marked fields, makeshift cemeteries with wooden markers. At the repatriation center, chaos reigned. Thousands of Japanese civilians were being processed. Red Cross workers moved through crowds with clipboards. Allied soldiers maintained order. Bradford walked directly to the processing desk with his documentation. 43 civilian females, non-combatant status, cleared for repatriation per medical and security screening. Here are the manifests. The overworked Allied officer barely glanced at the papers. Medical clearances signed. Security assessment complete. Transport arrangement, all confirmed. They need to be processed immediately. Some have critical medical needs. The officer stamped the documents. Processing line 3. Next. It was that simple. The machinery of post-war bureaucracy swallowed them up. Within hours, the women were registered, given identification papers, and assigned to a repatriation ship leaving for Japan the following week. They would be housed in a temporary camp with other civilians until departure. Helen found Fumiko in the processing crowd. "This is as far as we can take you. From here, you're on your own." Fumiko clasped Helen's hands. "You have given us life. You have shown us that humanity can survive even the worst darkness. We will never forget." She turned to Ruth and spoke in Japanese, and Ruth translated through tears. "Tell your family that they raised a daughter of great honor. Tell them a Japanese woman said this." Sachiko hugged Ruth tightly. "Maybe someday, when the world is healed, we can meet again as friends instead of as enemies." Ruth hugged her back. "I would like that very much." Sergeant Williams awkwardly shook hands with several of the women who had learned his name, offering gruff goodbyes and last-minute medical advice. Even Captain Bradford, standing at attention, allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement to the group. As they drove away from the repatriation center, no one spoke. The magnitude of what they had done settled over them. They had circumvented direct military orders. They had falsified documents. They had risked their careers and possibly their freedom. But 43 women who had been marked for death would go home. 43 lives saved. 2 weeks later, the official inquiry came. The women scheduled for transfer to Manila had disappeared. Captain Bradford, Lieutenant Thompson, Nurse Nakamura, and Sergeant Williams were all questioned extensively. Their stories were consistent. Due to medical complications, the patients had been transferred to the civilian repatriation program under proper authority. All documentation was in order. The investigating officer was suspicious but couldn't prove any wrongdoing. The case was closed with a notation of administrative irregularity but no formal charges. Helen received a private reprimand in her file. It would affect her promotion prospects. She didn't care. Ruth faced additional scrutiny because of her Japanese heritage, but her record of service was impeccable. The inquiry found no grounds for action. Sergeant Williams was transferred to another unit, though whether as punishment or to avoid further questions was unclear. Captain Bradford retired from the military 6 months later, citing personal reasons. Years later, in 1952, Helen received a letter. It was forwarded through military channels addressed simply to Lieutenant Helen Thompson, American nurse, Okinawa. The letter was in English, carefully handwritten. "Dear Lieutenant Thompson, this is Sachiko Yamamoto. I am writing to tell you that I have completed my nursing degree and now work at a hospital in Tokyo. I specialize in maternal and infant care, inspired by what you taught me. Fumiko Watanabe passed away last year at age 78, but before she died she asked me to ensure you knew that she considered you a daughter of Japan, an honor she gave to very few. Keiko and her daughter, Helen Yoshida, are living well. Young Helen is now 7 years old and wants to be a nurse when she grows up. Her mother tells her the story of the American nurses who saved them, so she will understand that kindness is stronger than hatred. All 43 of us survived. We have built lives from the ashes. We remember. We teach our children to remember. Not the war, not the hatred, but the moment when enemies chose to be healers instead. Thank you for seeing us as human beings when the world saw us as expendable. Thank you for risking everything to give us a chance at life. With deepest gratitude and respect, Sachiko Yamamoto." Helen kept that letter for the rest of her life. She never sought recognition for what she had done. She never told the story publicly. But she knew that in the worst moment of history, she and her companions had chosen compassion over compliance. They had proven that even in war, humanity could survive. 43 lives, 43 families, generations that would exist, because a small group of people decided that mercy mattered more than orders. The story of the Japanese women POWs who expected execution, but were saved by American nurses, remained largely unknown for decades. It wasn't a story that fit comfortable narratives. It complicated the clear lines of hero and villain that wars demand. But for those who lived it, it was the truest story of the war. Not the battles won or the territory gained, but the moment when people chose to be healers in a world designed for killing. History remembers the grand gestures, the famous battles, the political decisions, but history is also made in small acts of courage. In a detention center on Okinawa in 1945, a handful of people decided that compassion was not weakness. They decided that the enemy could be redeemed simply by being seen as human. They saved 43 lives, and in doing so, they saved something of themselves. They proved that even after years of war, years of hatred and violence, the instinct to heal could still overcome the instinct to destroy. That is the story that deserves to be remembered. That is the legacy that should endure. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel to hear more untold stories of courage and compassion from history. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us which part of this story resonated most with you. History is more than dates and battles. It's about the choices people make in impossible moments, and those stories matter. Thanks for watching.